I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1711 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast, news about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In the previous episode of this podcast, I was talking about a group of people known as the Viet Kieu. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's spelled K-I-E-U. Whatever it is, it refers to the Vietnamese living overseas. There are approximately 5 million Vietnamese who got out of Dodge when the communists came in and took over South Vietnam because they knew what was in store for them. The commies, as my good Cuban buddy from Naples, Gustavo Rivera, would always say, "He no nice man." That would be a good description of the communists who took over South Vietnam. They were definitely no nice. Because of that, many South Vietnamese got out of town, went wherever they could. Many of them paid with their lives for their efforts to get out of Vietnam. But a lot of them made it and did well wherever they went. They went all over the world. A lot of them came to the United States. Some went to Australia. Some went to France, England, Thailand, all over the place. The vast majority of them did quite well. They talk about the Vietnamese who went down to Australia and had to move into the, cheaper neighborhoods. Well, okay, I'll say it. They had to move into the slums. Before you know it, those slums became very nice places to live and work because of those hardworking Vietnamese. Today, about 500,000 of those Viet Kieu people have returned to Vietnam, and they're doing very well. After looking at the story of what happened to these Vietnamese, it reminded me of a biblical story. That's right. This whole thing could be biblical. It reminded me of the story of Joseph. If you are not familiar with the story of Joseph, it took place way back there, about 600 B.C. The Israelites were wandering around the Promised Land, just doing their thing, trying to make a living. There was a man there named Jacob. He descended from Isaac himself. Jacob, as was the practice back in those days, had lots of children. He had 12 sons, probably wore his other wives out, and then he married a hot young babe by the name of Rachael. They had a son named Joseph. Unfortunately for Joseph at the time, Jacob had a tendency to dote on his youngest son. He was probably a fair-haired boy. Well, the other brothers didn't appreciate that. They decided to do him in. They threw him in a hole. Didn't want to kill him right out, but they said, we'll put him in this hole and that'll be it. And then they decided, wait a minute, we can make some money on this deal. We can sell him into slavery down in Egypt. That's exactly what they did. And they figured that was the last they would see of their fair-haired little brother named Joseph. Well, they were wrong. They did see him again. Long and short of the story is this. Joseph was taken down to Egypt and thrown into slavery, the lowest of the low. But he didn't stay there. Because he applied himself, he rose up to become the number 2 man in the entire nation of Egypt. Later, he was able to help out his brothers who got into trouble. They had a big famine up there where they were living. They had to go down to Egypt looking for food. Guess who helped them? That's right, their little brother Joseph, who earlier they had thrown away and left for dead. And as it turns out, he helped them survive. That's exactly what's happening over in Vietnam today with the Viet Kieu people. They were thrown out of their country. Many of them died in the process. But wherever they went, I think due to the hard times that they had been through, they worked hard, they studied, they improved themselves. And even though they were forced to leave their home country, many of them wanted to return. It's only natural. Well, as things turned out, this is almost biblical. In the late 1980s, the South Vietnamese communists wised up and realized that communism was, in fact, a stupid, bankrupt system that did nothing more than bring hardship and starvation to a country. Being the smart people they are, they threw it out. Started this program called Doi Moi and opened up their economy, and they haven't looked back since. Many of these Vietnamese who were living overseas saw what was happening back in their home country and decided to go back there. And it turned out to be a godsend because these Vietnamese had gone overseas and received valuable training. They became very proficient in such fields as banking, private equity operations, fund managers, entrepreneurs. They became very proficient in other fields like architecture, design, medicine, entrepreneurship. That is exactly what Vietnam needed when it decided to go to an open market economy. Communists didn't know how to do any of those things. It took a while to get started. But once these Viet Kieu decided to come back home and help their country, things are blasting. They're doing great. I'd like to share the story with you of another one of these Viet Kieu people who went back to their home country and are making a big difference. This story comes from the same article I found on the Euro Money website, portions of which I shared with you yesterday. Title of the story was International Finance, Vietnam's Diaspora Returns with Attitude. Just a reminder, diaspora refers to people who had to leave their home country. The story was provided by Ellis. He did a great job, did a lot of research putting this story together. That's another reason I want to share it with you. In this episode, I'm going to share with you the story of none other than Pham Ngoc Bich, spelled B-I-C-H. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Bich took sort of a different route in his journey back to his home country. That's why I'm going to share it with you. He was not one of those who got on a rickety boat, had to float around in the South China Sea for days while people died of starvation and had to stand up to the pirates who would come around and steal whatever they had, shoot them, rape their women. He didn't go that route. He went on a different route, but it was still difficult, and he had a very hard journey. So let's take a look at it. Title of this section of Ellis's article is Extraordinary Journey. Let's take a look. Dateline, Ho Chi Minh City. At leading brokerage Ho Chi Minh City's Securities Corporation, its managing director of corporate finance, Pham Ngoc Bich, takes time to reflect on his extraordinary journey back to Vietnam. Born in the Highland city of Dalat, Bich was educated at the prestigious Lycée Yersin in that city and grew up speaking French and Vietnamese at home. Isolated Dalat was comparatively untouched by the war, but he remembers as a 12-year-old in 1968 hiding with his parents in the closets of his family home as the Viet Cong attacked the city during the Tet Offensive. We were young and we were not afraid of anything. That means he was a typical youth. I spent a little time up in the mountains near Dalat. Never went to that place, but I heard a lot about it. Supposedly Theodore Roosevelt used to go there and hunt, because in Vietnam they seemed to have every kind of animal you ever heard of. It was almost like a mini Africa. They had elephants, lions, tigers, orangutans, Burmese pythons. If I remember correctly, they did have some combat going on in the Dalat area, even though it was sort of isolated over there in those beautiful mountains. Enough about Dalat. Let's continue with the story. In 1974, the 16-year-old Bich won a South Vietnamese government scholarship to study engineering at the Polytechnique Montreal in Canada. Note, the year was 1974. You know what was about to happen. In 1975, the commies came down and took over. At that time, Bich was over in Montreal studying engineering. Bich puts it this way: a year later, no more South Vietnam. His South Vietnamese sponsors fell to Northern forces while he was in Montreal. Bich was watching the end game on TV. I could not come back, he said. I had to work as a busboy and a waiter, whatever I could. It was Desperation City. Bich was abandoned with the rest of his bourgeois family back home and facing re-education as Hanoi's doctrinaire communist imposed control on the defeated South. Common to many Vietnamese families, just like in our own Civil War, there are contradictions. He has uncles and cousins on his father's side that fought for the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese. On his mother's side, he had uncles who fought for the victorious North. He said he lost 4 uncles during the war, 2 on each side. Just like in our own Civil War, there were many cases where families were split. Holding down multiple part-time jobs in Montreal alongside his engineering studies, Bich then worked to sponsor his family to leave Vietnam, eventually bringing 15 relatives to Canada. Did you note that? That even after his South Vietnamese sponsors went away, he continued studying engineering there in Montreal while he worked as a waiter. He eventually made enough to bring 15 relatives to Canada. He remembers, it took me 10 years. I didn't have enough money to bring all of them at one time. Trained as an engineer, Bich says he fell into banking in the 1980s after losing money in the New York stock market. I wanted to know why, so I decided to go for an MBA in Montreal. Then I switched into banking and have been in it ever since. Apparently he found his true love. Bich started at a bank in Nova Scotia in 1983 as an assistant manager at a branch in downtown Montreal. But a drive for deal-making saw him promoted to Scotiabank's corporate team. Later came a stint at the Montreal Derivatives Exchange before he joined the CIBC-linked Fund Management TAL Asset Management. In 1998, he was sent to Hong Kong to start a China-oriented fund management joint venture between TAL/CIBC and Hong Kong tycoon Li Ka-shing's Chung Kong Holdings. I know I butchered that pronunciation, and I'm apologizing here and now, but I'm moving on. As the only Vietnamese in the group, Bich says in Hong Kong he learned Mandarin and Cantonese, which linguistically overlap with his native Vietnamese. You got to believe this Bich person is a smart individual. Not only did he learn engineering and get an MBA, but he learned 2 different dialects of Chinese. He could make his way in any Chinese restaurant. Vietnamese wasn't on Bich's professional radar, but while he was in Hong Kong, the Hanoi government accelerated the opening up of its economy. Vietnam was the new frontier, and Bich says, my phone was hot. They were looking for bankers and fund managers, and there were no people there to do it. A chance meeting in Hong Kong with Scriven from Dragon Capital got Bich thinking about returning, and by 2007 he did, joining British insurance group Prudential's fund management arm. Bich says the attitude towards Vietnam by its overseas community, and equally by Vietnamese toward the Viet Kieu, began changing in the early 2000s. When he returned in 2007, he says Hanoi still officially referred to the U.S. government as the enemy. Even after the U.S. trade embargo was lifted in 1994 and diplomatic relations established a year later. Nowadays, Bich says the U.S. is considered a good friend by Hanoi, illustrated by Hanoi hosting the U.S.-North Korea Rapprochement Summit in 2019. It also holds that Vietnam's historic wariness of neighboring China allows the U.S. strategic room to move. A veteran China operator, Bich says that the axiom one often hears in Hong Kong that China's ruling Communist Party is less a political party than a chamber of commerce applies equally in pragmatic Vietnam. Although China is Vietnam's biggest importer, Hanoi keeps a diplomatic distance from Beijing and hasn't, for example, been an enthusiastic supporter of China's Belt and Road Initiative. The conservative factions are getting older and older, and the younger generation are very business-oriented, very practical, he says. There's a change happening. Still, Bich says none of his Canadian-based family are keen to return to Vietnam. As for his teenage lycée classmates, he is the only one to do so. They are all in France, Australia, and the U.S. He says various family members, some of whom endured communist re-education after 1975, have often asked him, "Why are you in Vietnam? Why do you go back and work with the communists?" I say communist or no communist. Now they are normal people. No one wants to come back here and ride a motorcycle to work, says Bich. Me, I don't mind. Bich is looking forward to Vietnam's expected upgrade on international market indices and economic measures from frontier market to emerging market. A lot of money will then flow into Vietnam, he says. He expects that within the next 5 years, the state's cap on foreign ownership of public companies will be raised or even scrapped. But with his still reluctant family in Canada pursuing careers, Euromoney asked Bich if he has any regrets about returning to Vietnam. This is what he said to that question. He said, "Yes, I should have returned to Vietnam earlier. I would be very wealthy." That's the story of Vietnam Kieu member Pham Ngoc Bich, a native of the beautiful city of Dalat, up there in the central highlands of Vietnam. Today, he's down in Ho Chi Minh City, helping turn that country around and make it an even bigger economic powerhouse. From what he says, if they make a few changes there that they're looking at, it's going to get even better in Vietnam. Who knows? Someday Vietnam may overtake China as a world-class economy. But they would still have to be on guard against their big neighbor to the north. Ever since the year 40 AD, China has been beating up on Vietnam. And they've continued that practice down to this very day. I have a feeling the pugnacious Vietnamese are going to be able to hold their own against their big neighbor to the north. Big bad China. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1711 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for listening to these stories. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?